together this weekend about grace. I don't have to remind all those of you who are there, and I really don't have to remind anybody who's a Christian. Grace is one of those words. It just stands right there as part of our vocabulary. And the journey of discipleship is all about grace. So it's not like we've talked everything through on the weekend. How could we? How could we? We're on a journey whose destination we have not yet reached. We are still on the journey, and we're on this journey, as we learned this weekend, together. We're not Lone Ranger Christians, grace shooters out on our own. We're in the community together where we help one another to grow in grace and in knowledge of Jesus. And therefore, our conversations will just continue. They're not over. They'll never be over until we get to our destination. But one thing comes to my mind when I think about grace and God's actions beginning before we are aware, drawing us to Himself, and helping us to enter into this relationship with Jesus, and that is this. Most of the things that go on before begin without our awareness. They're relatively unknown to us until later. Only after we get into this God relationship do we see the points in our life, in our past, that have brought us to the present moment. So if I were to title this sermon, I would say, Grace Works Unawares. We're not aware of it. This is a wonderful piece of news because our world lives minus God. Most people aren't necessarily looking for the graceful ways God is calling to them, or how He's preparing them for this encounter with Himself. I think that's amazing. God could just chuck people off and say, well, that's enough for you. You don't care, you're out. No. He works underground and in every possible way to reach people who are unaware of Him. Amazing. But we know, as believers here, we're aware that Jesus wants to save. And grace pulls puzzle pieces together until that happy moment comes. Oh, happy day when Jesus washed my sins away. That good old gospel song. The story that I want to share with us tonight, or for all of us to look at tonight, is a very modern story. It is minus God in any obvious way. God is not mentioned in the story. The storyline contains elements similar to what many people are experiencing. So let's enter this discussion. The Old Testament book of Esther is where I want to lay my position tonight and frame this sermon for us. The Jews are in exile, and I think that's a place where many people on the planet are. They're not at home. They've been forced away. I mean, this story is pretty good because it catches people across the planet that are not where they want to be. And an exile is not where they want to be. They're away from home. Remember that long journey many of the Jews made when Babylon came into Jerusalem and leveled it and forced them to leave and go to Babylon. Later on, some came back to return to rebuild the temple, but many of the Jews just remained in the diaspora, scattered. I think we see that everywhere in the world. People leave their countries because of all kinds of reasons. Some go back home, but many stay where they have been exiled to. It's just part of life, the journey we see. And in the fortress of Susa, a king resides over a huge empire, the Medes and the Persians. And this Old Testament book begins with a huge party. I read that this party took 6 months. I mean, I couldn't believe partying for 6 months? Really? I mean, that's a long time to party. 6 days are too long for me. 6 hours I find sometimes strenuous, but 6 months? But I suspect if you think of an empire, everybody had to gather. It maybe took people a month to get there. So partying took a while. And the king is at the center of the activities, and everyone shows him proper respect, except the queen, who displeases him. And I've read some things that suggest he wanted her to do some stupid stuff in front of all the guests. Kind of a striptease moment, perhaps, for the queen to please all these male guests, and she said, not with me. It was a Me Too moment in the Old Testament. Anyway, the king is not pleased, not amused, as we hear that phrase. And so, right in front of everyone, he sends her off, and in consultation, he removes her. And now, what do? You have to find somebody who's worthy, in his eyes, to succeed her, to become his queen. And this is a rather strange story. I mean, this whole book of Esther has some strange stuff in it. But if you think looking for Germany's next top model is strange, you should read this text. It's a bizarre search, and the preparations for the candidates for Queen of the Day are also bizarre. I read this stuff and I thought, you're kidding me. No, prepare to go to the king, it was a real deal. But perhaps what is most interesting in this story and most unique is that the candidate, that no one really knows where she comes from, is a young Jewish girl in this mix. The Jews are scattered across the entire empire, and a number of them live in Susa. And one Jew, Mordecai, becomes a foster parent to this orphan cousin, Esther, who is in the harem of the king, preparing among the other candidates to try out for queen. Amy Oden comments, Esther is a nobody among nobodies in this minority community. She's a nobody. But this nobody, Esther, is beautiful. And she ends up in the selected ones in the king's harem, away from the safety of Mordecai's home. I was thinking that must have been terrifying for her. I would think as a young orphan girl, relatively young, I would suspect, to be in this harem with all these other bizarre persons in the harem, being prepared for an entrance to the king's chamber. I mean, that must have been spooky material. It's like a good story for a movie, I suspect. A Jewish exile as candidate for a queen? Well, that's a wild story. The Persian royal court is a place of intrigue on many levels, and Esther is like a fly caught in this web. She's a resident alien, she's a foreigner, and she's in a group just tolerated by the Persian Empire, and really she's hidden. Nobody knows she is Jewish. It would be a no-go in that setting, so she kept that really low-key. Nonetheless, this nobody becomes queen. At first it seems that she fills a role. Otherwise, everything seems rather routine, except for one quiet connection that she always has to Mordecai. That's an interesting thing. That is always kept in place. And Esther hears one time of a plot against the king, and Esther tells Mordecai, and he uses this inside information to save the king's life, and that incident is written down in the records of the court. And his name, Mordecai, is registered for his good work. But life is not idyllic. Where is life idyllic? This isn't one of these modern fairy tale stories. Life is not idyllic. Mordecai has an enemy in the court. That's not a good place to have an enemy. Haman knows that Mordecai is a Jew. And why does Haman know this? Because Mordecai has never bowed down to him when he went by. You know, Mordecai never bowed down to anything but God, anyone but God. And so when Haman went by and expected him to show him respect, and Mordecai didn't, well, that made Mordecai mad. And even though everybody else was respectful, Mordecai was not. And that irritates Haman to death. I think we see this somewhat in our world. There's leaders with power, 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 and as soon as a journalist says, what about this? They can't stand it. Anybody who doesn't show the proper respect, you're out. And so Haman lays plans to not only get Mordecai, but he figures, when I'm getting Mordecai the Jew, I might as well get rid of all the Jews. Well, where have we heard of that before? So he organizes a pogrom. That sounds so modern, you almost get chilled to the bone when you read his plans. Mordecai hears of the plans, and he puts on mourning clothes. He tears his clothes. He's weeping and wailing outside, and he can't go to the king looking this messy. And so Esther hears about this and wants to find out, why is Mordecai having this problem out in the street behaving like this? And asks the message, what's going on? And now the story becomes pure drama. She hears about Haman's plans, but she has no clue what to do. If she can do anything at all, the interesting question. And why should she do anything? I mean, it's risky business, the position she's in. Mordecai pushes her, but she pushes back at first. Without any official invitation into the court of the king, if she went in there unannounced, she could be killed. And that would be the end of the story. She doesn't see herself as having any power, or that she can make any difference in any way, or that she should even get involved in this mess. But Mordecai adds on this pressure. Esther 4, verses 13 and 14. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. And some people have said that hints at God, but it's not written. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Amy Oden points out that Esther's personal history intersects with the Jewish corporate history. And you know, I think it's important for all of us to realize that our lives are not just being lived only for ourselves. And as I will want to shape a little bit more the issues of grace in this story, it's important for all of us to understand we're part of something bigger. Our personal histories intersect often with the history going on around us. And we have some of the responsibility, like Esther has, of involvement, engagement, doing something when it's time for us to do it. And it's interesting, at this moment, although God is not mentioned, Esther asks that all the Jews in Susa pray and fast for her as she's making this decision. I find that interesting. God's not mentioned, but prayer and fasting is. That's a wild one, too. If you reflect for a moment on all of this, it seems to me that the story contains grace that will save. And yet it's not obvious until the crisis comes. Is that true for us as well? That God's goodness is working in our lives even though we're not aware of it? Does it become obvious in moments of crisis how God has been working? For God is still at work. God is still in Susa with his people. even though Esther seems isolated from contact with most of them. And then there's this one word of grace in Esther 5, 1-2. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her. The word translated in German says he showed her grace, favor, Gnade gezeigt, says the German. And he welcomed her and held out the golden scepter, so Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter and could be in his presence and tell him what was happening. Now, Queen Esther pulls out all of her courage, risks going to the court. The king shows her grace and extends the scepter, and it's interesting to me that Esther has a plan. And I thought to myself, how did she get a plan? She was clueless before. But people prayed, and grace unraveled in showing her a plan that wasn't her own. Invite the king and Haman to a banquet. Well, that's not tough, to get two men to show up for free food. I mean, I even go for free food sometimes, don't you? And so the unraveling of Haman's scheme begins at a banquet. Catherine Schifferdecker says that there are many coincidences that conspire to defeat Haman and save the Jews. Esther, out of all the women, just happens to become the queen. The king just happens to have insomnia on the night of Esther's first banquet, and he couldn't sleep. And the court records were brought to be read to him. You know, you have sleepless nights and you read a book. Well, he couldn't sleep, the king, and so the court records were read to him, and what happened to be read to him about Mordecai the Jew who had saved him? And Haman just happens to come to the court when the king is contemplating how to reward Mordecai, and the list goes on. The king reads about Mordecai, and then Haman comes in, and if you read the story, it's hilarious. The king asks him, well, how would you reward somebody who's wonderful to the king? And Haman thinks, oh, he's thinking of me. And the king is thinking of Mordecai. John Levinson reminds us, a coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. And if you read the rest of the story, it's very intriguing. The Jews are saved from being destroyed. The story is kind of messy. It's not one that we would read to our children before they go to bed at night. But at the end of the day, the bad man, Haman, is out of the picture. His plan backfires, and he falls into the pit he has dug for Mordecai. The life of Esther intersected the larger story, and she reveals how God keeps his promises to his people. He's faithful to them. He saves his people even when there is no way to anticipate that life would have this kind of meaning. Grace goes before. Grace works unawares. And so back to the question of grace in our lives. What is your storyline? What is your storyline? Where in the everyday events of life has God's presence, his grace, been at work? When did you see that God was there? From which perspective did you understand he was present? Frederick Buechner, the theologian, says, the question is not whether the things that happen to you are chance things or God's things, because of course they are both at once. There's no chance thing through which God cannot speak. He speaks, I believe, and the words he speaks are incarnate in the flesh and blood of ourselves and of our own footsore and sacred journeys. Be not afraid, for lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. He says he is with us on our journeys. He says he has been with us since each of our journeys began. Listen for him. Listen to the sweet and bitter airs of your present and your past for the sound of him. In the ordinary events of life, and even in the not-so-ordinary moments, in chance encounters, in the moments you did not expect, discern where God is present in all of these things. Where is he calling to you? And maybe we can have the courage, like Esther, to respond to the challenges that he gives us. She took the risky leap, responding to all of the ways that grace, God's going before, had led her to. And finally, she was saved, and many others with her. She wasn't just saving her own skin. We're not just saved for ourselves, but for others.
Yes.
God is interested in saving. Grace draws us toward this saving intention of God. All the ways of grace in our unique situations point us to the way of Jesus, for he comes directly to seek and to save. Like the Esther story, we may not yet see how all of these puzzle pieces of life come together, but God is at work. He is still there. His grace is at work, whether we see it clearly at first or not. And his intention is to save and to give us life. And all the people said, amen.